All right, so today we're going deep into the sometimes a little messy world of local government.
That's right.
And we're taking a look at, some excerpts from city council meeting minutes and video transcripts.
Yeah, some real inside baseball here.
Right, and specifically we're going to see what these documents can tell us about how a city is run and all the different dynamics, all the players involved.
I think it's almost like you said, peeking behind the curtain
Exactly.
to see how the sausage gets made.
Yeah, and these sources you sent over, they actually include some pretty pointed questions from a resident named Don Slater.
Oh, yeah, he definitely doesn't hold back.
Right. And then there's this brief but kind of loaded comment from the city attorney, who we'll just call Jim for now.
Yeah, to keep things simple.
Yeah. And then we also have some really strong opinions that were voiced during public comment. And those are about a ballot measure that's being referred to as Measure DD.
Lots to unpack there.
Okay, so let's start with Don Slater.
Okay.
His comments, they really jump out at you from the very beginning. He's firing off these questions right away, directed at the city clerk, the mayor, and the entire city council.
Right off the bat.
And a lot of these questions, they revolve around the Brown Act.
Which is super important in California.
It is. And for folks who maybe aren't familiar with it, the Brown Act, it's essentially California's open meeting law.
Exactly. It's all about transparency, making sure the government's business happens out in the open where people can see it.
Right. And Slater, he doesn't mince words. He states very clearly that in his view, the city attorney is subject to the Brown Act.
He's not messing around.
Not at all. And he goes so far as to allege that the city attorney was actually in clear violation of the Brown Act at a meeting that took place on July 1st, 2020.
During public comment, no less.
Yeah, during public comment. And unfortunately, we don't have the specifics of the alleged violation laid out in these documents.
Yeah.
But, the accusation itself is a pretty big deal.
Oh, yeah. It raises serious questions about transparency.
Exactly. And it kind of makes you wonder, what are the rules of engagement here in these meetings?
For sure.
Slater also throws out another concern, and it's about a council member possibly using a shill to try and get around the Brown Act.
That's a loaded term.
So what are the implications there when you hear that kind of accusation?
Well, the word shill, right away, it suggests that Slater is worried that a council member might be trying to influence decisions.
Behind the scenes.
Right, outside of those public meetings, using this, intermediary, this other person. And if that's happening, that cuts right to the heart of what the Brown Act is trying to prevent.
Yeah, because the whole point is to stop, backroom deals and make sure that the public can see how these decisions are being made.
Exactly. It's not just about, oh, you broke this rule. It's about potentially eroding that public trust.
Absolutely. And Slater doesn't let up there.
Yeah.
He goes on to argue that it's actually the city clerk's job to report any Brown Act violations.
Wow, he's putting a lot on the clerk's plate.
He is. So what does that tell you about how he sees the clerk's role?
Well, it raises the question of, checks and balances in the system.
Right.
He's basically saying that the clerk, as, an administrative officer, they have this duty to be like a watchdog.
A Brown Act watchdog.
Yeah, making sure everyone's following the rules. And that's a specific expectation about who's responsible for upholding those open meeting laws.
Okay, so then Slater kind of switches gears a little bit, and he makes some very strong accusations about the truthfulness of statements that have been made in these meetings.
This is where it gets really interesting.
He claims that a Mr. Melching, and we're assuming this is the city attorney just based on the context,
It seems likely.
that this Mr. Melching made false accusations against someone who was speaking during public comment.
Wow.
Yeah. And he specifically says that Mr. Melching lied when he claimed that this public commenter had made personal attacks against members of the city council.
So what stands out to you the most about that?
I mean, he's not pulling any punches. He comes right out and says this is a lie. And I think more importantly, it signals that there's this potential breakdown in trust.
Yeah, between everyone.
Right, between the people of the city, the council itself, and their legal counsel.
Yeah.
If a resident like Slater believes that these accusations from the city attorney were false and that the council just sat there and did nothing, that suggests that there's a real disconnect.
For sure, a rift between everyone.
And then Slater, he doesn't stop there. He broadens his criticism to include the entire city council.
He's on a roll.
He says that they all knew that Mr. Melching was lying, but they chose not to defend the person speaking during public comment. And he even uses the word righteousness.
So it's not just about, procedure or the facts of the case.
Right. It's about a principle for him.
Yeah, it's about right and wrong and the council not taking a stand for what he sees as the right side.
Exactly. And that paints a picture of a council that's maybe unwilling to challenge their own attorney or maybe even, complicit in this alleged misrepresentation.
It makes you wonder what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah, for sure.
What's the relationship like between the council and their attorney if they're not willing to speak up?
Okay, so then he kind of shifts his focus to the role of the mayor, which I found interesting.
Okay, what do you have to say about that?
Well, he seems to believe that the mayor is the one who's ultimately responsible for keeping order and maintaining decorum during these meetings.
Makes sense, I guess, since the mayor is the one running the meeting.
Right, and he even mentions that he sends his comments to the mayor before the meeting, specifically for review.
Whoa, like for pre-approval.
Yeah, just to make sure that everything's, in line with the rules of decorum.
That's interesting.
It is, and it tells us that he sees the mayor as, the real authority figure in that room.
The one who sets the tone.
Exactly. And then he goes on to make a sharp distinction between the mayor's role and that of the city attorney.
Like a comparison.
Yeah, and specifically, Slater says very strongly that the city attorney has absolutely no business getting involved with matters of decorum.
He's drawing a line in the sand there.
He is, and he says that the city attorney shouldn't try to overrule the mayor when it comes to decorum.
Why do you think he feels so strongly about that?
Well, I think for Slater, it's all about, staying in your lane.
Yeah.
He probably sees the city attorney as the legal advisor, someone who's there to offer guidance on, points of law, not on the tone or the content of what people are saying during public comment.
So that raises a big question about, who's really in charge when it comes to decorum.
Yeah, where's the line between the elected official, the mayor, and the legal advisor, the city attorney?
It's a blurry line sometimes.
Right, and to really drive his point home, Slater brings up a specific incident that happened at a meeting way back on February 4th, 2015.
Oh, wow, going way back.
Yeah, and he claims that the city attorney at that time, and again, we're assuming this is Mr. Melching, that he interrupted, confronted, and even badgered a speaker during public comment.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah, and he even named some people who were there, Greg August and Matt Lee Meyer, and he says that there's a YouTube video out there that shows this whole thing going down.
So he's not just, making vague accusations. He's giving specifics.
Right, he's saying, I've got proof.
Which adds a whole other layer to it.
Yeah, and by bringing up this past event, it really suggests that Slater sees this as a pattern of behavior.
Not just a one-time thing.
Exactly. He's basically saying, hey, this has happened before, and it's still a problem.
Makes you wonder what else might be going on that we don't know about.
Okay, so now let's fast forward to a more recent meeting, and there's this really short but revealing exchange. When the city attorney, Jim, is asked if he has any reports, his response is, no, Mayor. I'm going to try and keep myself out of any more turpitude.
Ooh, that's a loaded word.
It is turpitude. It's not something you hear every day. And legally, it often refers to conduct that's seen as, morally wrong.
It's definitely not a compliment.
Not at all. So when Jim says this, it suggests that there's been some kind of incident or some serious criticism in the past that would warrant that kind of language.
Yeah, like he's trying to avoid repeating a mistake.
Exactly. And it really hints at these underlying tensions and past conflicts that, as listeners, we're not fully aware of, but we can definitely sense that something's there.
There's a story there.
Okay, so let's shift gears completely and talk about this public comment that focuses entirely on Measure DD, which is described as a 1% additional sales tax. And this commenter makes it crystal clear that they are not a fan.
Not a fan at all.
They come right out and say that Measure DD has already robbed the people of $33 million, and they project that it's going to take another $56 million over the next 5 years.
Those are some big numbers.
They are, and it immediately frames this whole measure in a very negative light.
It gets your attention, that's for sure.
And they urge listeners to repeal Measure DD, arguing that if they do, that residents will get to keep more of their own money and their quality of life will improve.
So they're painting a very clear picture of the benefits of repealing this tax.
They are, and they even go so far as to dismiss any potential negative consequences as just scare tactics.
That's a bold move.
It is. So what's the strategy there?
Yeah.
Why frame it that way?
Well, by using those really strong terms like robbed the people, and then dismissing any counter arguments as, just fear-mongering, they're trying to really rally opposition and make this whole issue seem very simple. It's classic political rhetoric, present one side as the good guys, the other side as the bad guys.
Yeah, make it black and white.
Exactly.
What I found interesting was how the commenter tries to kind of normalize the idea of the city operating without this additional tax.
How do they do that?
Well, they point out that the city supposedly functioned just fine for 8 years without Measure DD, and they even bring up neighboring cities like Elsinore Canyon Lake and Paris. and they claim that these cities don't have a similar extra tax.
So they're trying to make it seem like this tax is unusual or unnecessary.
Yeah, like, hey, our neighbors are doing just fine without it. Why do we need it?
Which can be pretty persuasive, especially if you're already skeptical of taxes.
And the commenter also takes the time to explain how those essential services like police, fire, and 9/11 are typically funded. They emphasize that those are covered by property taxes and regular sales tax revenue.
So what's the point of that explanation?
Well, I think they're trying to directly counter that argument that Measure DD is absolutely necessary to fund those vital services.
By saying, hey, those things are already covered.
Right, and they're basically suggesting that those core services are being adequately funded without this extra tax.
Which again, if you're someone who's already leaning towards voting, that can be pretty convincing.
And then the commenter gets pretty critical of how Measure DD was presented initially.
What do they say about that?
Well, they accuse the city of cleverly marketing the measure to mislead voters.
Ooh, that's a big accusation.
It is, because it's basically suggesting that the city wasn't honest with the public.
Yeah, that they were trying to hide the true purpose or the impact of Measure DD.
Right, and that really strikes at the heart of public trust.
For sure, because if people feel like they can't trust the information they're getting from their local government, that's a huge problem.
And the commenter just keeps going. They accuse the city of wasting money foolishly. And they call another measure that's on the ballot totally unnecessary money wasting.
So they're really painting a picture of a city government that's out of control with spending.
Right. And then they even throw in some interesting political language. They praise the mayor for not falling for the Queen's Gambit, and they say they hope that other council members will come to their senses.
Okay, so break that down for me. What's the Queen's Gambit, and what does all that mean?
So the Queen's Gambit, it's a chess opening where a player sacrifices a pawn early on in the game.
To gain an advantage later.
Right. So in this context, the commenter seems to be saying that the mayor has resisted some kind of political maneuver or some pressure related to these ballot measures.
Like something that looked good on the surface but was actually risky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it just hints at all this political maneuvering that might be happening behind the scenes.
It's like a whole chess match is playing out here with these ballot measures.
Right. And then finally, we get the mayor's response to this very passionate public comment.
What did the mayor have to say?
Well, first, they acknowledge the comment and they point out that we're living in strange times where public comments are being submitted by email and read by staff.
It seems like a small detail, but it's actually kind of significant.
It is, because it suggests that the mayor might be trying to distance themselves and the council from the content of these comments.
Yeah, like, hey, this is just what this one person thinks it doesn't necessarily reflect our views.
Exactly. And it also acknowledges that the way public engagement is happening has changed, maybe because of the pandemic or, other factors.
Without directly addressing the criticism itself.
Right. And then the mayor goes on to specifically say that the views expressed in this particular comment don't represent the views of city staff.
Which is probably a good idea, given how strongly worded that comment was.
Yeah, it's a way of protecting city staff and maintaining a neutral stance.
Making sure they don't get dragged into the controversy.
And then the mayor addresses what they see as veiled, if or not very well veiled, personal attacks on individual council members.
Ooh, that's tricky.
It is. They acknowledge that this kind of language is outside of the decorum policy, but they also say that it's protected by free speech.
So it's a balancing act, right, between maintaining order and respecting people's First Amendment rights.
Exactly. And the mayor's statement really highlights how difficult that can be, especially when you're dealing with a public forum where people have strong opinions.
It's a tightrope walk for sure.
And then the mayor ends by saying that the commenter was free to express their views on the ballot measure, just as someone with the opposite viewpoint would be.
So they're upholding the principle of free speech, even when they disagree with what's being said.
Right. And it's a pretty neutral way to wrap up that segment of the meeting.
It's like they're trying to de-escalate the situation.
Yeah, exactly. So as we've taken this deep dive into these city council documents, what are some of the big takeaways that stand out to you?
Well, I think what's really interesting is how all these seemingly separate issues, the Brown Act decorum, the accusations of dishonesty, the debate over the tax measure, they all come together to show us just how complicated and messy local government can be.
Right. It's not always pretty.
It's not. It's real life. And we're seeing a community that's wrestling with these big questions about transparency, accountability, and what they want their city to look like in the future.
Yeah. And I think the concerns that Don Slater raises, they speak to this desire for more accountability and for the government to be more open and transparent.
Exactly. And then you have the debate over Measure DD, which shows us that there are these deep divisions in the community about fiscal policy, how much the government should be spending, and whether people trust their elected officials to handle their money responsibly.
These documents, they really offer us this, behind-the-scenes look at how these different interests and perspectives clash within a community.
It's a microcosm of what's happening all over the country.
Right. And I think it reminds us that local politics, even though they don't always get as much attention as national or state politics, they can be just as intense and important because these are the decisions that directly impact people's everyday lives.
Absolutely. And the decisions are being made by people just like us with their own flaws and biases.
So it leaves us with a big question. How can local governments balance the need for transparency with the need to have respectful and productive conversations, even when there are strong disagreements?
Right. How do we make sure that everyone feels heard, but also that things don't devolve into chaos?
Yeah. And what role do the council members, city staff, and the public all play in making that happen?
That's definitely something to think about.
It is, and it's a conversation that I think we need to keep having.
For sure, because local government, it affects all of us.
Absolutely. And that's a wrap on this deep dive.
Until next time.
See you then.